One, check one, check one, check one, check two. Caffeine, check one, check one, check two. Hello everyone, my name is Ian and you're watching Big Rock Moto. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and if you appreciate content like this, I hope you'll consider subscribing. Now, one of the most common comments that I get on a lot of the videos and a lot of the reviews that I put out is that a lot of the new motorcycles, especially the higher end adventure motorcycles, they're just too expensive and people really struggle to make a commitment of that magnitude. As some of you know, if you've followed my channel for any length of time, I've really known for owning a lot of different motorcycles. And in fact, I've owned close to 40 different motorcycles since I started riding about 20 or 25 years ago. And many of those motorcycles have been adventure and dual sport motorcycles. I think this puts me in somewhat of a unique position to sort of evaluate and recommend different used bikes in terms of adventure bikes and dual sport bikes. So here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to walk you through my personal recommendations for used adventure and dual sport motorcycles, and I'm going to break it out by different price levels, which I'll show you here in a second. Now, before I jump into this, just a couple quick housekeeping notes. If you appreciate things like this that take all this time and research to create, please consider supporting the channel by using my affiliate links when you're shopping for parts and riding gear. Join Patreon to get behind the scenes access, and always like, subscribe, and comment on all the videos. Some other housekeeping notes. The bikes in this buyer's guide are really the bikes that I chose that have some off-road capability, some decent off-road capability. So while there may be other adventure styled motorcycles out there that you could look at, I'm really focusing on those bikes that I feel have some level of off-road ability. I hope that makes sense. Also, I'm only including bikes from 2005 and later, so that's going back over 15 years. I'm filming this in February 2023, so I didn't really want to go back to the 90s or the 80s because I just figured it's a smaller number of people looking to get a bike that old, so we're keeping it 05 and later. Also, I'm really choosing motorcycles that have somewhat reasonable maintenance requirements, so I'm not choosing bikes with race engines or bikes that, you know, you're going to have to rebuild the engines all the time, things like that. And my final note really is that I'm really focusing on what I consider the mainstream brands. So I don't mean to offend the smaller brands or offend people that own bikes from smaller companies, but here in the US, we often don't get those kinds of models. So in modern day times, you're looking at things like CF Moto or Benelli or things like that. We're not getting so many of those yet, and especially looking at used, those aren't just going to come up on the list. Now, as I go through this, please comment down below and let me know what bikes I've missed. So as we're going through the price levels, just put it down there in the comments. You know what? For 2,500 bucks or for around that price, I've found XYZ bike to be a really good buy. It's very possible, it's very likely that I've missed a lot of bikes, so please do that. Put that down in the comments below. Let's have a discussion and let's make this a community effort. Now, a couple more things. You can download this entire presentation. I'm making it available as a free download below. There's no strings attached. There's no advertisements or signups or anything weird like that. And I promise it's not a virus. So if you want this information on your computer, you can download it. Again, just consider supporting the channel by using my affiliate links and things like that. So here's how we're going to break it down. We're going to do it by price level. Now, these prices are a general guide. So of course, when I say $2,500, it's just a ballpark. You might find one of those bikes around $2,000 if you're lucky, or it might be $3,000 or $3,500. It's just a general guideline of something around that price. And I did verify by looking, when I developed this guide, I did go out and check on Facebook Marketplace, on ADV Rider, on Craigslist to see if my prices were generally in line. I think COVID and supply shortages have kind of pushed the used motorcycle prices up a little bit, just like they have with cars. So keep that in mind, but I still think if you look hard enough and you negotiate, these price levels are going to make sense. Also, there's going to be a timestamp in the video for each of these general price levels. So if you know you have a budget of, let's say, $5,000 or $7,500, you don't have to watch the whole video. You can just watch that segment and those timestamps will be down below. All right, it's fine to timely get started. No, that's not it. All right, it's time to finally get started. So at the $2,500 price level, let's run through these bikes. Now, of course, I think if you know me, you know I have to start off this guide by talking about Kawasaki's KLR 650. So here's how we're going to break down each of these bikes. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on each bike because this video would be hours and hours long, and that's just not going to be good for YouTube. So I'm going to list the pros, the cons, and then a couple things that are nice to know. And of course, I highly encourage you to do your own research, do your own homework before going out and purchasing any of these motorcycles. So what are the pros to the KLR 650? It's comfortable, it has a decent amount of wind protection from the little miniature fairing that actually works better than you would think, pretty large fuel tank, and a really good aftermarket support for this bike. What are the downsides? It is really pretty heavy for a single cylinder bike. The bike did gain weight over the years as the generations went on. There are also some known issues with the bike, so you've all heard of the doohickey if you're familiar with KLRs. They have kind of a weak front brake, a weak headlight, although that was revised in 2008. So what are the things nice to know about the KLR? Well, there's a couple things. The revision. So the KLR has three main generations, 1987 to 2007, 2008 to 2019, and then 2022 and later. So you're not going to get, obviously, the third generation fuel injected 22 and later for $2,500. So you're mostly going to be looking at the Gen 1 bikes 1987 to 2007. And I do have a review on the Gen 1 KLR that you should check out. You might get lucky and find a Gen 2 bike, 08 or later, for around this price level. And if you're looking at that Gen 2 bike, the suspension was a little better, the fairing and wind protection was better, they changed the instruments, and the brakes and headlight were a lot better. So probably worth upgrading to that Gen 2 if you can fit it within your budget. Next up, Suzuki's venerable DR650 SE. This is such a well-regarded bike around the world for being just a total workhorse, dependable, and something that's been in production for a very long time. So the pros, it's reliable and it's simple. It's pretty good off-road. It's basically a giant dirt bike or a giant dual sport. Pretty long suspension travel, good ground clearance. It's not too heavy, so it works pretty well off-road and would be good for somebody looking to do like a lot of the backcountry discovery routes or BDRs that we have here in the USA. Another pro to this bike, just like the KLR, really good aftermarket support. Now, what are the cons? So when you look at this compared to like the KLR 650 of the same generation or the same year, this bike doesn't have any wind protection, which is an issue if you're traveling at highway speed all day. It also has a really small fuel tank from the factory. So the fuel tank, I think, is around 3 to 3.4 gallons, somewhere in there, compared to the KLR with the 5 or 6 gallon tank. So a lot of people end up putting on an aftermarket fuel tank if you want to go over about 120 miles per tank of gas. What's nice to know about the DR650, it's very easy to lower this bike. So Suzuki's always offered a factory lowering kit. It has a linkage suspension, so you can change that linkage, get the rear of that bike to come down. You can drop the front forks. It's designed to be able to do that, and it'll work fine. So for riders who are a little bit vertically challenged, this could be a very good option for you. Next up, we have the Honda XR650L. Now keep in mind, this is the L, not the R. The XR650R was an off-road only, non-street legal bike that dominated Baja racing for some time, totally different engine, different bike, different chassis altogether. So the XR650L, what are the pros? It's reliable and it's simple. This is kind of becoming a trend, right? With these sort of carbureted kind of old school bikes, right? Like this in the DR. It's really good off-road. So among these big single cylinder dual sports, the XRL is the best of these off-road. It has really good suspension, really good ground clearance, very good off-road machine. And of course the other pro, it's a Honda. So reliability should be top notch. What are the cons? This bike is incredibly tall. The seat height is something like 37 or 37 inches tall. So if you're anything under about 5'10" or 178 centimeters, 1.78 meter, this bike's going to be challenging for you. What's nice to know about the XR, again, always research these models. There's a lot of details that you could look up on the internet, but they do tend to run a bit hot, especially with the oil. It is an air-cooled engine as opposed to the water-cooled on the KLR, and it does tend to run a bit hot, and there have been some issues with that, so just keep that in mind. All right, next up at $2,500, and of course you know I can't leave out this bike, one of my favorite dual sports of all time. It's a legend at this point, the Suzuki DRZ 400S. And I do recommend sticking with that S model. If you find the E models that have been converted to street legal, my only issue with that They did have a different carburetor and they're more powerful if you get the non-S model, the dirt model, but a lot of times those street legal conversion kits are just very kind of chintzy and they tend to have issues with the wiring. So I don't know, keep that in mind if you're looking at those E models. So I'm talking about the S model here, which came from the factory, is a street legal bike. The pros, it's reliable and it's simple. You can fix it with baling wire and duct tape and maybe, you know, a carburetor cleaning now and then. Really, really good off-road. So if you're looking for an off-road focused bike, you're not planning to do much time on the highway, the DRZ is really, really good. And now I know what you're thinking, well, it's only a 400, it's not the 650, but honestly, this bike is just as fast as a DR650 or a KLR 650, but you get a much lighter, much more off-road capable package. Now you are giving up some of that highway ability, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. So we've covered this, great off-road. The suspension is really very, very good on the DRZ. It's fully adjustable and it can deal with a lot of off-road punishment. So I think you'd be happy with that. What are the downsides? I already kind of got ahead myself on this. It revs out on the highway a lot. So if you're going over about 100 kilometers an hour or above about 60 to 65 miles an hour, because it only has a 5-speed gearbox, it starts to feel pretty buzzy and the engine is really working pretty hard. You know, everyone always says if they give the DRZ 6 speeds and fuel injection, it would be game over for all the other dual sports. Everybody would just buy a DRZ at that point, which is true. I would buy one too. So keep that in mind. It's going to be a little bit busy on the highway. Also, being this a dirt bike chassis, dirt bike style with all this ground clearance, long suspension, the seat is very tall. So vertically challenged riders, if you're anything under about my height, about 5'10" or about 178 centimeters, it's going to be challenging for you. What's nice to know about the DRZ is that it also comes in a super motard version. So a super motard bike is going to have a little bit different suspension setup. It's going to have the smaller 17-inch wheels with sticky street rubber. So if you want to do mostly urban riding, or you actually do want to do supermoto riding or tear up some twisty canyon paved roads, the Supermoto is something you can look at. And I know there's people who get the Supermoto model and then have a dirt set of wheels that they then put on. So keep that in mind, something to look for. But mechanically, in terms of the engine, transmission, and chassis, the Supermoto and the Dual Sport are basically identical. Now, up to this point in this presentation, I've owned all the bikes I've been talking about. However, I have never owned a Suzuki DR200 SE. So this is going to be that lower price, lower to the ground, lower horsepower, more basic bike for somebody just looking to get into this. So what are the pros? It's reliable and it's simple. So as opposed to the DRZ 400, this is an air-cooled motor. Of course, it doesn't have much power, being just a 200. It's a very good beginner bike. So if you're just getting into some off-road riding, maybe you want a beater bike to learn on off-road, or just this is what your budget dictates and you can find these, it's really good for beginners. And I don't just mean a new motorcyclist, but I mean anybody who's looking to get into off-road riding. So maybe you're an experienced street rider, but you want to start to learn off-road. Get something like this and beat up on this for a year or two while you learn to ride trails before you get a fancy adventure bike that you're going to drop and crash in the dirt. Another pro is that this bike has a really reasonable seat height. It's not super tall like a lot of the other bikes that I just showed. What are the cons? Limited power for the highway. You're probably going to be at 55, 60 miles an hour, around that 100 kilometer an hour on a good day. And it's very old school. This is a very, very dated design. So if you're expecting modern touches, modern performance, you're not going to get any of that from this bike. What is nice to know, so in 2013, they did an update to this bike. I think it was a lot of styling updates. They kept the same engine though, so keep that in mind. Oh yes, the Yamaha TW200, the famous T-Dub. These have been made famous because they're affordable, low to the ground, and they've got these cool fat tires. So who should look at this bike? So the pros, reliable and simple. And I promise I'm not just cutting and pasting. These are true for all these bikes. It's a good beginner bike and it has a very low seat height. So because the whole chassis sits low to the ground, the seat height is very reasonable. So shorter riders, this could be something you should be looking at. What are the cons? It's not a good highway bike. You know, 55, 60 miles an hour, around 100 kph is going to be about where you're at with this bike. Wouldn't expect to do much more than that. And it's very old school, just like we mentioned with the DR200. What's nice to know? So the fat tires are really advantageous in slippery conditions, mud, clay, snow, deep gravel, things like that at lower speeds. So, the bike doesn't have the power to push these bigger tires at high speeds, racing through the desert. But for lower speeds, that's why a lot of people call this a farm bike or something like that. Really, really good to look at. So this is a great option, and a lot of people really ride the wheels off of these little TWs. All right, I can already hear all you v-strom loyalists cheering with applause about me putting the v-strom first. So jumping into the $5,000 price bracket with the Suzuki v-strom 650. What a legendary, amazing motorcycle. I owned one of these bikes a long time ago. It was one of those bikes that I actually kept for a few years. Surprisingly, for me, that's a long time. And I put a lot of miles on it. I love these bikes. So what are the pros here? The engine. Oh, what a legendary Suzuki 90-degree V-twin engine. Super smooth, good power, never breaks down. What a great engine. Super reliable. You don't hear about V-stroms breaking down. They just don't. Also, extremely comfortable. For longer rides, let's say you're going to ride to Alaska, you're going to go on a round the world tour, you're going to carry a lot of luggage, maybe a passenger, you're going to be doing a lot of riding at higher speeds, 75, 80 miles per hour or 120 kilometers an hour. Plus, this is a good bike for that. For the money, you're going to be hard pressed to get a better touring bike for this amount of money. Now, what are the downsides to the v-strom? Yes, there are. Some people have fought me on this one, but in my experience, the v-stroms, they really do struggle off-road. The suspension geometry and the 19-inch front wheel, they really, in the soft sand or gravel, they will want to tuck the front end and push. They have limited ground clearance, so you're going to hit the engine on obstacles. You're going to need to get a bash plate if you're going off-road. And limited suspension travel, so bumps are going to be very, very rough to ride over the bumps. So keep that in mind. You can go a lot of places with the v-strom. You're just not going to be going as fast, and you're going to have to pick your line a lot more carefully. The other con is that these bikes are not exceptionally light, so you're looking around that 500-pound mark, but it's not bad for what it is. It's just not a lightweight motorcycle. So the nice things to know about the v-strom, the first generation was 2004 to 2011. That's the bike in the picture here. And then in 2012, they went to the second generation 650. You're going to pay a little more for those. It might be worth it. They updated the styling. They made a few small changes here and there, nothing major. It was essentially the same bike underneath. I think the brakes were a little different. They may have made a few suspension tweaks, some tiny tweaks to the engine. The fuel tank got smaller, I think. Anyway, you can find those details on your own. But the second gen is something to look at. But I still think the best value is going to be that first generation 650 v-strom. All right, next up at the $5,000 level is the Kawasaki Versys 650. Now, I know I said at the beginning of the video that I was only going to choose bikes with genuine off-road ability, and I'm pushing that rule a little bit here, but I really wanted to include the Versys. And with that being said, I've seen people use these Versys 650s in pretty crazy off-road conditions that you would not believe. So I think they do have the capability, although they do have some vulnerabilities and sort of weak points if you're going to off-road, which I'll talk about here in a second. So what are the pros to the Versys? The Versys is a great all-around street bike, urban use, commuting, touring, sport riding. It's such a good versatile bike. Get it? Versys, versatile. Kawasaki called this the Versys for versatile system, and they were right. So great street bike, extremely reliable. You don't ever hear of a Versys 650 breaking down. They just don't. Also, it's extremely practical in almost any sort of condition you could throw at it. Now, what are the cons to the Versys? So as I mentioned, it's really not set up very well for off-roading, and fans of the Versys for years have been wishing that Kawasaki would make something more like a KLR with larger wheels, more ground clearance, more suspension, but with this engine. But of course, Kawasaki has not been able to do that. So the cons, you've got the smaller 17-inch front wheel, ground clearance is pretty limiting, you've got that exhaust running under the engine, which is pretty vulnerable if you're gonna hit a log or a rock or do much off-roading. There's not much suspension travel there. So yeah, keep that in mind. Not the best bike for doing a lot of off-road riding, but it can do a little bit of it. The other downside that I didn't list on here, I've ridden these quite a bit. For me, the engine is a little bit lacking in personality. It's not like the new 270-degree crank parallel twins where they have that nice throaty sound. This one sounds more like an overpowered vacuum cleaner to me, especially with the factory exhaust, and I just don't find it that exciting or engaging to ride. Performs well, relatively quick, good fuel economy, not much vibration, just doesn't excite me, if you know what I mean. So what's nice to know? So you have the first generation, 2007 to 2009. Second generation Versus was 09 to 2014. And then in 2015, they had the third generation. So they have updated the styling and updated the bike over the years. But the basic idea of the bike, a small parallel twin engine, good fuel economy, practical, comfortable, all that stayed the same. They've just made updates over the years to make it more modern. And I do have to admit, in my opinion, the first generation was a little bit ugly, if I'm being honest, and then I think the later ones did get a lot better looking. So depending on your budget, you could maybe find one of the newer bikes. All right, this is a bike we haven't talked a lot about on this channel, but it's a very, very good motorcycle. So the BMW F650 GS. So this was a single-cylinder adventure motorcycle or big dual sport motorcycle that, of course, BMW stopped producing quite a number of years ago, and it's kind of sad to see it go. So what are the pros to the 650 GS? It's a simple and reliable single-cylinder engine, so it's relatively small, lightweight, and compact, good fuel economy. Also, these are pretty good off-road because they're not too big and heavy, and they've got good power delivery from that single-cylinder engine. You know, you've got the larger front wheels, especially like on the Dakar model, so these can be pretty good off-road. What are the downsides? Well, I think one of the reasons that BMW went away from this line is that people wanted more power. People were riding their bikes as touring bikes on the street, on the highway. So these were not as powerful or nearly as smooth as the later twin-cylinder parallel twin GSs when you got into the 700 GSs, 800 GSs, and bikes like that. Now, what do you need to know about the 650 GS? So when you see the Dakar models were the off-road oriented model. So that had the 21-inch front wheel and more suspension travel. The bike you see here in the photo is more of a standard model. Now, in 2008, they redesigned the bike, redid the bike, and it went to a twin-cylinder engine, entirely different motorcycle. But the naming with BMW could be very confusing because they got away from using the engine size in the name of the bike. So I won't get into all that, but just know that those later bikes, once they got into the twin-cylinder bikes, if you're looking at what they called a 650 GS or 700 GS, it wasn't a 650 or 700 engine, it was actually an 800cc engine, but it was detuned, so got confusing. But back in the old day with this bike, it actually was 650 meant it was a 650cc single-cylinder engine. Next up on the list, along the same lines of that bike, is the G650 GS Sertao. So they went away from the F designation, they went to the G designation because the F bikes became twin-cylinder bikes. I'm getting a headache thanks to BMW's marketing here. So the Sertao really was, in my opinion, a continuation of the 650 GS Dakar model. Very good off-road, good power for a single. This engine was the last single-cylinder engine, I believe, that BMW produced, at least here for the US market. Of course, it's not as powerful as a twin-cylinder, and because this bike was only made for a few years, the aftermarket's really quite limited for this bike compared to bikes like an 800 GS or 1200 GS. What's nice to know is that this was the last single-cylinder BMW adventure bike that they made. All right, next up at the $5,000 price point is Honda's venerable CB500X. Now, I've done at least two different videos on this bike. I love this motorcycle. Very, very good motorcycle. So what are the pros? So this bike, just start out, you've got a parallel twin engine, very smooth, very good fuel economy, decent amount of power, just under 50 horsepower. Pros, Honda durability. The bike is also very comfortable. You can ride it all day long, and I definitely have. Fuel range is very, very good because the fuel economy is good and it's got a pretty large fuel tank. And the engine is very smooth running, good power from the engine. What are the cons of the CB500X? So the limited wheel size and ground clearance for off-roading. So the earlier bikes did come with 17-inch wheel front and back. They did update that later, which I'm going to get to in the next bullet point. But these earlier CB500s, they were a little bit limited by their lower suspension travel and a smaller front wheel, but you know, to be honest, you could do a lot with these bikes. It just depends on the rider. So You want to put off-road protection and knobby tires on these, you can, and they work surprisingly well. And it really fills a void because there's not many bikes at this price point or engine size or sort of level that are good off-road adventure bikes. So it's just, that's the void in the market that people kind of saw this as filling. Now, what's nice to know about the CB500X? So in 2019, the bike was revised quite a bit, and following the trend of adventure bikes, more people using off-road, they went to a 19-inch front wheel in 2019. They also made some other small tweaks, but same engine, same basic bike, honestly. So if you can afford a little bit more budget, or if you can find one, try to get a 2019 or later. Next up, for $5,000, you can buy the legendary KTM 950 Adventure. So we'll cover the details, but the 950 were the earlier models that were carbureted and not fuel injected. So this bike came out in around 2003 and ran to about 2006. And you can find these bikes. I've seen them even below $5,000, but there's some stuff you're going to have to watch out for. All right, so breaking down the 950, the pros are this bike has really unbelievable off-road capability. So when this came out, it kind of blew a hole in the adventure bike world because nobody else was really building big, powerful twin-cylinder adventure bikes that were this good off-road. The GS could not even hold a candle to this 950 when it came out. So off-road ability was inspired by the Dakar-inspired design, and they used things like the Dakar Rally to sort of help develop this bike. The engine was powerful, over 90 horsepower, and it sounded amazing, especially with a set of exhaust pipes on it. Really, really nice. What are the cons? So you are going to have to be a little bit careful with these. There have been mixed reliability issues with the 950s as they got some miles on them, and I should know because I did own one of these. I owned a 2006. So water pumps, fuel pumps, quite a few mechanical things. You do have to really keep up with the maintenance, and there are some things. This is one of the only motorcycles that I've owned that actually left me on the side of the road with, I think it was a dead fuel pump maybe. So you're gonna have to make sure the preventative maintenance has been done on these things and do your research if you're buying one. They were also tall and they were kind of heavy, so compared to the 790s and 890s Adventures that we're lucky to have today, these bikes were relatively tall and top heavy. They didn't handle as well as the newer 790s and 890s, obviously. And that's why we went away from these. So they don't make the best beginner bikes because of that. So what do you need to know? So I mentioned this, the carbureted models were between 03 and 06. Some people like those. Personally, I'm not a fan of carburetors, although they can run really well when they're tuned in right. They got really bad fuel economy though, the carbureted ones. Fuel injection came in 2007 and later, and then they went to the 990, so they went to a slightly larger engine, they went to fuel injection, and in my opinion, the later bikes were the best. So the last few years of the 990, I'm talking like 2010, 11, I think 2012, I forget when they stopped, somewhere in there, those were the ones to get. If you really want this platform, try to budget a little bit more, get a later 990 if you can. Although if your budget only allows this $5,000 level 950, it's still fine, but they really got a lot better. A lot of the bugs got worked out in those later models. Next up for $5,000, Honda NC700X. Now, just like I said for the Versys 650 and kind of the CB500X, I'm pushing the limits here of, kind of being off-road capable. This is more of a giant scooter or commuter bike, but still, I've seen people set these up for adventure riding and be pretty successful with them. So I wanted to go ahead and include it because it's a great motorcycle. The pros: low seat height, low center of gravity. This bike is specially designed to keep all the weight down low because of the way the engine and chassis are designed. You also have, kind of like a scooter, a really cool underseat fuel tank, storage trunk. You can put a lot of stuff in there. Also, the fuel economy on these bikes was very, very impressive. So very, very cheap to run. What are the downsides? Well, it's really not designed, honestly, to go off-road. Ground clearance is limiting, wheel size is limiting, suspension tremble is limiting. It's not a super lightweight bike. So yeah, not the best for off-road, but if you just want to do a little bit of dirt roads, but you mostly want a practical bike for doing everything else, the NC700 is pretty amazing. So what's nice to know here is it's got that scooter practicality, but it looks and feels like a big full-size motorcycle. One of my favorite motorcycles, honestly, truly one of my favorite motorcycles, and I'm not just saying that. For $5,000 used, you can get a KTM 390 Adventure. Now, don't misjudge this bike. Hearing the 390, you're thinking, oh, that's small, it's not much power, I'm not gonna fit on it. No. First of all, engine size has nothing to do with ergonomics. It's a full-size motorcycle. You can be a full-size guy, big guy, and still ride this and be perfectly fine. And the engine has a lot more power than you would think. It's got over 40 horsepower. So this is my favorite small adventure bike. People can argue with me about that and let me know if you disagree with me, but this thing is so much fun to ride and so capable. Pros, you know, very fun to ride. It's good on the road, twisty roads, freeway. It's got power to go 90 or 100 miles an hour, unlike some bikes like the Honda 300s that I've been talking about lately. And off-road, it's very, very good. What are the cons? Ground clearance is limited. You are gonna run into some issues with that if you're getting more aggressive, riding over big rocks or big ledges or logs or things like that. And the seat height is not as low as I would like to see, so it's not as beginner friendly as I would like. So the seat's still pretty high, but again, you're getting that off-road ability, which usually comes with that higher seat height. What's nice to know is that, well, honestly, you can buy a new one for about $6,000 or so, plus taxes and fees and dealerships fees and all that, which honestly is probably going to end up being more like $8,000. And that's why I think it's important to include here, because for around the $5,000 level, you can probably get one of these used, maybe with some accessories and additions to it that have already been done or nice upgrades, and not pay all the taxes and dealer fees and stuff. So very, very good purchase for $5,000. All right, next up is the Yamaha WR250R. Now, I've owned one of these bikes in the past, and it was a really, really great motorcycle. And I think if you go back far enough in my channel archive, I probably have a review on this bike. So what do you need to know about this bike? So the pros are, it's basically a dirt bike with lights and all the street legal equipment, and it uses a street bike engine design. So what do I mean by that? Well, some high-performance dual sports like the KTM EXC models or certain Husqvarna models, they use engines that are really more of a race engine where you have to do oil changes very frequently, valve adjustments very frequently, top ends and pistons every couple of years. Not so with the little WR250R. Just like the modern dual sports, like with the Honda 300 engines or the Kawasaki KLX 300, this was a very low-stress engine with long service intervals. So can be very, very good for lightweight adventure riding. And, like I just said, it makes a very good lightweight adventure bike because you've got good electrical capacity from the generator if you want to run heated clothing or extra lights. There's a lot of good aftermarket support for it, larger fuel tanks, luggage racks, whatever you want to do. This is a great platform to do just about anything you want to do. What are the cons to the bike? Well, it's tall. Long suspension travel, a lot of ground clearance. It's a really, really good off-road performer. It's basically kind of a dirt bike with, street legal equipment on it. And also the engine torque is limited. So being that smaller capacity engine, you don't have a lot of punch from the engine. It revs out pretty good. To get the power, you really have to rev this thing out. But if you'd like to have larger engines that have a lot of torque, or you like to spend a lot of time on the highway at higher speeds, with the passing power to get around traffic, this engine is a little bit limiting, obviously, in that regard, being that smaller capacity. Everybody always wished that Yamaha would make a 400 or a 450 version of this. That would have been unbelievably amazing if they did that, but of course they didn't. So we were stuck with the 250 version. So what's nice to know about the WR? So people will sometimes call this a WRR or the WR squared to set it apart from the dirt bike model. So Yamaha obviously has dirt bikes of all different sizes, including a 250 dirt bike. But what made the WRR special was it was street legal and it had that street bike design engine as opposed to a dirt bike engine with the higher maintenance. Other thing you need to know is that they don't make this bike anymore. So it might be kind of cool to have one of these, hold on to it, because nothing quite like this really exists. This bike was kind of special because if you look at a modern dual sport like maybe the Honda 300L or the KLX 300, this Yamaha that I'm showing here was a little bit higher performance than those. The suspension was pretty good chassis. So anyway, if you're looking at this bike, you should also see bikes like the KLX 250 and the CRF 250L from the same kind of year ranges at this price point. All right, moving into the next price bracket here. This is $7,500 US. And again, of course, that's just a ballpark number, but these bikes are going to come in around that price point, or at least available, depending on what year, starting around that price level. So let's start with the Triumph Tiger 800s. So these 800 Tigers came out, I think, around 2011, and they were really designed to compete with the BMW F800 GS, which came out in 2009. So this was one of the bikes that really helped kick off the mid-size adventure bike craze that we have going on now. So the pros to this bike, very smooth, very nice sounding, the famous 3-cylinder Triumph triple engine. Great motorcycle engine. These made very, very good sport touring bikes to ride, if you're going to do a lot of highway riding. And the XC models are really good off-road. We'll talk about that in a second. What are the cons to the Tiger 800s? They were a little bit top-heavy. They weren't quite as mass centralized as maybe like a KTM 950 or F800 GS, but they weren't too bad. The other thing that some people don't talk about, but you can find if you dig deep enough, is that because of the geometry that Triumph uses on the front end, it uses kind of a steep suspension rake angle, which means that even on the XC models, which are the off-road models, they're a little bit harder to ride in soft surfaces like sand or mud or gravel, because they have a tendency to want to tuck the front end in and be more unstable. It was just a characteristic of the chassis geometry that Triumph was using at the time. So what do you need to know? Well, the XC models were the off-road ones. So the XCs had the longer travel suspension, they had the 21-inch front wheels, they had the spoke wheels as opposed to the cast wheels you see. So this was the standard Tiger 800 here in the photo, and then the XCs were the off-road ones. Now, in 2015, you need to know that Triumph made a pretty major update to the bike. So the bike's got a whole electronics overhaul. They got things like cruise control. They also introduced a different naming scheme. So they had instead of the base model, they had like the XR. So the road models were the XRs and the off-road models were the XCs. Then they had like the XRX and XRA and the XCX and XCA. They were just different trim levels with more equipment. So they, going on with the theme of, these mid-size adventure bikes getting more fully featured as they are now, Triumph was definitely riding that train at the time. And so you saw those updates. If you can't afford it, I highly recommend getting the 2015 or later, because I think the improvements were very well worth the money. Next up at $7,500 is the legendary BMW F800 GS, and I happen to own one that looked just like this one in the photo. I bought this when it first came out because it really was, other than the KTM 950 and 990 Adventure, it really was the only off-road capable mid-size adventure bike that you could get. So what were the good things about it? The engine was made by Rotax, and it was very, very dependable. Not the smoothest engine or the best sounding engine. It's not the 270-degree crank parallel twins we have nowadays, but still very, very good power plant. The off-road ability of this bike was excellent, especially for the time. So this would even hold up well to a lot of the more modern mid-weight adventure bikes. It's not going to be as good as an 890 Adventure or maybe some of the newer bikes, but still very, very capable in the right hands. Also, aftermarket for this bike is very good because it had such a long production run. There's a lot of good aftermarket parts for this bike. What are some of the downsides? These bikes did not have the modern electronics that we enjoy today. So it didn't have off-road traction control or off-road ABS. The bikes did have ABS, which you could switch off, but the ABS was very rudimentary. And I can tell you from experience that it's not like the ABS systems today where you can get away with leaving them on in the gravel or the dirt. You had to turn it off. Otherwise, it was very dangerous because it really wouldn't let you stop. You didn't have things like cruise control, obviously, back then, so you're missing out on that stuff. But again, you're coming in at that lower price point. Also, the engine, for everything I've said about the engine, they are a little bit buzzy. I did a lot of touring on mine, and above about 75 miles per hour, what is that in kilometers an hour? Above like 120, 130, the engine can be very buzzy coming to the handlebars. It was just the design of that Rotax engine. So what's nice to know is that BMW made a pretty big update to the bike in 2013. So if you can stretch the budget a little bit, they did a styling update, the suspension was a little bit different, they made some other tweaks, electronics and things like that in 2013, and I would tend towards those later models if your budget would allow. Next up at the $7,500 bracket is the KTM 990 Adventure. So I've already talked about this a little bit because I featured the 950 Adventure at the $5,000 price point. So what do you need to know? The pros, extremely capable off-road. KTM always gets that part right. Great suspension, great chassis, great handling bike for doing off-road riding. Also, the engines on these were very good, very powerful. They sounded amazing. They sounded better, a lot better than the parallel twins we have today. But you know, you saw the makers moving away from the V-twins, and you're going to continue to see V-twins be phased out because they're very hard to package. So where do you put the airbox? Where do you put the fuel tank? A parallel twin's more compact. That's why everything's moving away from the V-twins to the parallel twins. So what are the downsides? Very tall seat height. They're difficult to work on, and I don't know if I mentioned this with the 950s, but just to do something like change the oil, you have to pull off the gas tanks, and it's hard to get those things lined back up when you put them back on. I know as an owner, I owned a 950, and I owned one of these 990s. I think it was a 2011. It was the R model, which was the really tall suspension. So they did have different levels of these. You might see the Baja version, you might see the R version, or previously the S version, which had a longer suspension travel, even higher seat height. So keep those things in mind and do your research. Some things to know, the 2007 was the first model for the fuel injection. It was a little bit glitchy with the fuel injection, some of that. So I would tend towards the later models if you can. The later models, 2010 and later, were the best of this 990 platform by far, if you can afford them. But if you are buying like a 2007, just make sure that it's running well. Ask what fuel economy it's getting. You know, does it start okay? Are there any issues with jerky throttle or anything like that? Because they had that when the fuel injection started in 2007. All right, next up is the KTM 690 Enduro R, and the bike pictured here would be the bike prior to 2019. So in 2019 it was redesigned, got the smoother twin counterbalance engine. The one I'm talking about here is the one that was prior to that. So this would be the bikes built between around 2013 to 2018. So what you need to know about the 690 Enduro R. So the 690 has always been that bike that is in between a hardcore Enduro dual sport bike with a more racing focused design like a 500 EXC or 350 EXC. Between that and something like their 990 Adventure or the 890 Adventure or the 1190s or whatever it might be. So it's always been the in-between option. It uses an engine that was really designed to be used in street bikes, so it has longer service intervals compared to the dirt bike engines, and the bike is designed to have some longer distance riding in mind. So the pros are the off-road ability. If you're looking at this as an adventure bike and not as like an enduro bike, this is very, very good off-road. So if you are really focused on off-road riding, you're probably looking at something like the 690 if you want that much power. Very lightweight, very powerful. So the bikes, the first generation of these bikes was something like 68 or 69 horsepower, and then of course they went up to 74 horsepower with the redesign in 2019. That is a ridiculous amount of power for a single cylinder engine. So I did own one of these bikes. I owned a 2018 model, and I have some old videos on my channel about that bike. The downsides, the seat is tall. The engine has a lot of vibration, in my opinion, and the fuel range is very limited. So you're gonna have to keep those things in mind. It's not a good highway bike. It's it feels very stressed out. Anything above about 65 to 70 miles per hour or about 120 kilometers an hour, very stressed out above that. Tons of vibration, just not happy doing that. I felt like, you know, if KTM had given this a wider range of gears, like a taller sixth gear and a shorter first gear, that would have been great. Less vibration would have been great. They addressed some of that in 2019, but not enough. And for me, the 690 always just falls in that kind of weird middle ground between a dual sport and an adventure bike, which hasn't been very successful for me, although I keep buying them, I keep trying them out, and then realizing that I don't really like them as much as I do in my head. So what's nice to know, avoid the pre-2014 models. In 2014, they got a lot better with they got ABS, they did some improvements to the bike. Also, if you go back really, really far, I think they were a carbureted bike. You definitely probably want to avoid those just so you don't have any maintenance headaches. and the fuel-injected bikes were more powerful and they ran better. And also, like I mentioned, the bike was totally redesigned in 2019. So if you can stretch your budget up to about $10,000, I'm going to have that in the next segment, you can get the redesigned bike. It was totally redesigned and it's a much better motorcycle in 2019. Also know that the Husky that Husqvarna made, the 701, and that bike got the new engine a year early in 2018, but it's basically the same bike as the 690 Enduro. All right, a lot of people are going to be happy right now that I'm showing this because people always complain that I don't talk about the Yamaha Super Tenere. The reason that I haven't reviewed it is simply because Yamaha, for whatever reason, doesn't ever respond to my request to get press bike loans like almost all the other companies do, so I have not been able to get one for review. Now, I did own a Super Tenere way back, I think in around 2013. I bought one brand new, rode it for less than a year and decided it wasn't really my thing. I'll talk a little bit about why that is. But excellent motorcycle for the right person, for the right kind of riding. So what are the pros? It's an amazing long distance tour, big, torquey, pretty powerful 1200cc engine, shaft drive, no chain to maintain, very good highway cruiser bike, very good for long distance touring, very good for passengers. I mentioned the shaft drive. They don't break down. When is the last time you ever heard of a Super Tenere breaking down? They just don't. Now, the cons, there are cons. In my opinion, riding this bike, jumping back and forth between this and a 1200 GS of the same era or competing bikes, this bike always felt really heavy to me and really tall and very top heavy. Some people disagree with me on that, so you should try one out for yourself, but that's just what I personally found. What's nice to know, so in 2014, they made quite a few updates. You could get cruise control, which was a great addition. The electronics got better. They also had an optional electronic suspension model after 2014, which was a great thing to have on a bike in this category, to be able to electronically adjust for adding a passenger and luggage and things like that. So overall, Super Tenere, if you're gonna do long distance rides, if you carry a lot of weight and you don't wanna go off-road too much and don't mind the bigger bike, Super Tenere is a very reliable, very very affordable, budget-minded alternative to something like a BMW GS. Next up, another Suzuki v-strom. So the Suzuki v-strom 1000. So Suzuki has historically always made, well actually the v-strom started out only as a 1000, I believe in 2002 or 2003, and then they added the 650 in 2004. So what do you need to know about the 1000? Again, very reliable Suzuki, smooth, powerful, nice sounding, never breaks down, very good 1000cc engine that's been around forever. It's a 90-degree V-twin. They're reliable, they're comfortable, really good owners groups, aftermarket support for these bikes, great community around the V-strom. What are the downsides? Not a good off-road bike. Just, it's not. It's a lot of power, it's a lot of weight, it's top heavy. The suspension geometry is all wrong for off-roading. It's too sharp, the handling is too sharp, it's not very stable. I know I'm being sounds like I'm being mean to the bike, but just being honest, I've ridden these a lot. It's also not a good beginner bike, a little bit too heavy, too much power, a little bit too large, not that low to the ground. And overall, in my opinion, unless you're just a power junkie and you need that bigger punch from the bigger engine, the 650 V-stroms have always been a better balanced package in my opinion. The way that the engine power delivery works with the chassis and the brakes and the handling, the smoothness of it, the 650 always just feels like a better bike to me than the 1000, but that's just my opinion. So you need to know the first generation was 2003 to 2012, and then it was redesigned in 2013. So older bikes are going to be more affordable, newer bikes are going to be more expensive. And if you go on far enough, you start running into the 1050s and the newer V-stroms, and they made quite a few significant changes when you look at those newer bikes. All right, so why is the v-strom 650 on this list twice? Well, I think it's worth covering the next generation 650s, the 2012 and laters, as a separate topic. So if you have the $7,500 budget, you can probably get one of these updated v-strom 650s, and here's why that's good. So the pros are, they offered this in an XT version, which I'm showing here in the photo, which gives you the spoked wheels, which were very, very nice the first time Suzuki did that. The reason that spoke wheels are nice is they're able to absorb impacts off-road better without bending, and off-road riders just like to have spoke wheels. Also, visually, the styling of the bike changed a lot. The dashboard changed, the windshield changed. It just got more modernized, so to speak. Still got the legendary Suzuki, 90-degree V-twin, extremely comfortable, extremely reliable, all the things you expect from V-strom. Downsides, it's Still kind of the same bike though as the old v-strom, so it's not a great off-road bike even with the changes that they made. Still, limited ground clearance, limited suspension travel. The steering geometry is too sharp for off-road. I still maintain that's the case. So keep those things in mind. What's nice to know, we already talked about this, but the XT models are more off-road oriented. Now, if you see things like the Adventure, the XT Adventure, or whatever, usually stuff like that just means more features. So maybe it came with luggage, maybe it came with hand guards or whatever it is, but they're all basically the same bike. Next up on the list, this would be very high on my list if I had $7,500 to spend, would be a BMW R1200 GS between 2005 and 2012. So this would be the oil and air-cooled bikes as opposed to the later 2013 plus water-cooled or water boxers. So, pros, it's a GS. So if you want to be able to say to your friends or go to the coffee shop and say, I'm riding a BMW GS, then this bike is for you. But I'm being sarcastic, honestly. Obviously, I love GSs. I've had many of them. One of my favorite bikes of all time. A huge amount of torque. The GS has always been known for torque, big capacity engine, a lot of torque down low in the rev range for pulling out of corners, good for carrying a lot of weight, passengers, luggage, good for touring. Shaft drive. No maintenance on the chain, although there have been hit and miss issues with the shaft drives, to be honest. Tail lever suspension. Tail lever suspension, basically, when you dive on the front brakes, the front of the motorcycle does not pitch forward. It doesn't shift all that weight to the front, which is nice for riding on the road, for touring. I really like the tail lever suspension. And really, these GSs, I think, maybe even a little more so than the newer ones, they were very good off-road. Because the weight is down low, the boxer engine keeps the weight low, the bike has good torque delivery for off-road riding, they were actually surprisingly capable off-road on the right hands with the right tires. What are the cons? It's a BMW, so parts and maintenance can be a little bit pricey. And do your research. You know, the earlier bikes, well, that's my next point right here. So what's nice to know is that I would avoid the 05 and 06 models. I did own an 06 1200, and I regretted that because they have the servo brakes, which can fail, and it's like a $2,000 repair. So avoid that. Get an 07 or later, and really get an 08 or later. In 2008, it got a slight power bump. The bike was a little bit better. So I would prefer that. If you're looking at one of these, try to get a 2008 or later. Great motorcycle for the money. And if it's been well maintained, you've got some service records with it, and you get it for a fair price, you'll probably can ride it for a few years and probably be able to sell it for almost what you paid for it. All right, moving into our final and highest price bracket for $10,000 US. So if you have $10,000 US to budget for a used adventure motorcycle, these are the bikes that I'm going to recommend. So let's start out with the legendary BMW GS. So you're probably going to be looking at 2013 to 2015 at this price point. And it'll be a little bit hard to get these for $10,000. It might be $11,000, $12,000, but if you get lucky, you might be able to get one for close to 10. So, pros, it's a GS, so it comes with that status, and it's a great motorcycle. This is the water-cooled boxer engine. So in 2013, they went away from their oil and air-cooled boxer. They completely redesigned the engine, completely redesigned the bike, nothing shared in common, entirely new ground-up motorcycle, much higher performance, a lot more horsepower, more features. The electronics were like 10 years advanced from the old one, so great upgrade. Chassis on this bike is really good. It handles amazing on-road and off-road. The electronics are really good. You get cruise control, you get ride modes. Some of this stuff is optional, but most of the GSs are going to have it. Electronic suspension control, shaft drive, adjustable windshield. It's an amazing touring bike, an amazing sport touring bike, an amazing commuter bike. It's better off-road than you would think. There's so many reasons that I love the GS. Now, what are the cons? Well, just like with the other one, it's more expensive to purchase, and servicing and ownership parts can be a little bit more expensive than some other brands. Like I mentioned, these can be a little bit hard. I'm kind of squeaking this into this $10,000 level, but if you stretch to $11,000 or $12,000 for a nicer example, it's going to be worth it. And your cost of ownership should be relatively low, because I think your depreciation, meaning what you were able to resell it for a few years down the line when you upgrade, is still going to be pretty high. And like I mentioned, these were a huge upgrade from the oil air-cooled bikes. There's a few people that still prefer the more tractor-like feel of the old oil-cooled engine, but for me, there's no contest. I wasn't a huge fan of the previous GS, but when the 2013 bike came out, the transmission was so much smoother and better. The engine has so much more power. It just felt more athletic. Really, really love it. All right, next up for $10,000 is a KTM 790 Adventure. So yes, you can now get 790 Adventures for around $10,000, which is a really, really good motorcycle, very extremely capable, high performance motorcycle for 10 grand on the used market. What are the pros? Handling is amazing. So this uses the saddle style fuel tanks with the fuel down low. It was something that they kind of carried over from the 950s and 990s, but really they made it even better. This bike feels, let me put it this way. When this bike came out in 2019, it just blew everything out of the water in terms of an off-road capable adventure bike with the way it handles the suspension, the chassis, the electronics. So good. Really the best performing adventure bike, multi-cylinder adventure bike ever made. If you're just looking at performance, I'm not talking about reliability and some of those things, but just performance, you cannot beat these bikes. Low center of gravity, I've talked about that. What are the cons? People love to argue about this. I don't think reliability on KTM is all that bad as it's made out to be. And I think people really have a hard time proving that. I mean, there's no data on that. That's why I don't like to talk about it too much. But yeah, there has been some, I would say, a little bit higher than average reliability issues with this platform versus some other motorcycles. So there's been clutch failures, starting issues, some shock failures on some of the bikes. Sometimes the fairing bolt, the bolt that holds on the front fairing will break off because they didn't really design that well. There's been a few things, but most people have had good luck with them, and I wouldn't let that stop you from buying one because it's such a nice performing bike. Now, what's nice to know, so the 790 came in the standard model, which some people call the S, but that's not true. It wasn't called the S, it was just the base model. And then they had the R model. So the standard model, lower suspension, different suspension components, different valving, not as much adjustment, and shorter travel than the R. The R had the higher suspension travel, higher ground clearance, higher seat height, one-piece seat versus the two-piece seat on the standard model, shorter windshield on the R, taller windshield on the standard model. So you can see the standard model was more of the road-going bike or light-duty off-road, and the R was the aggressive off-road bike. So I think too many people overplay the R, and the base bike is very, very good for most people unless you just need the better suspension of the R model. Next up is going to be one of my favorite bikes of all time. I've owned a lot of them. I've featured them a lot on this channel. Is a Honda Africa Twin. So for $10,000, you should be able to pick up a pretty nice example of the CRF 1000L, which came out in 2016 and ran to about 2019. So what do you need to know? Great all-around performance, good road bike, good touring bike, good commuter, good sport touring bike, very good off-road, 21-inch, 18-inch wheel combo, long travel suspension, great electronics, great chassis, not too heavy, wonderful all-around motorcycle. The electronics is very easy to use, one button to turn off ABS on the dash. I really like these early Africa Twins for that. Traction control is a trigger, 3 levels. Level 1, very, very good off-road, very good amount of slip, very useful even in the dirt. These are reliable, some of the best looking adventure bikes ever made in my opinion. Just love these bikes. What are the downsides? A little bit top heavy, not a ton of power. The engine's a little bit boring, but it's reliable, so that's the trade-off. What's nice to know? So 2016, 17, the bikes were the same. 2018, they made updates to the suspension, the dashboard, the electronics. Might be worthwhile looking at one of those later models. Also, when you see the Adventure Sports model, the Adventure Sports is the more touring-oriented version, has a larger fuel tank, it has a bigger windshield, it has more features. So I think if you're doing a lot of off-road, I would tend to look more at the regular Africa Twin and not the Adventure Sports. If you're doing more road touring, higher speed riding, then the Adventure Sports could be good for you, or if you want that larger fuel tank. Another thing nice to know is that a lot of people will buy these. I guess this is true of all the bikes on this list, but you'll see a lot of these that have luggage and crash bars and tires and all sorts of stuff added to them, still for a very good price. You can get a heck of a bargain on one of these things. Next up, for $10,000, you can buy a very, very nice KTM 1190 or 1090 Adventure. I'll talk about the difference here in a second. So the pros to this bike, these had the amazing, legendary, big KTM, big displacement KTM V-twin engines, sounded great, ton of power, very smooth, wonderful engines. Suspension, as with all KTMs, tends to be very, very good for off-road and on-road. And these were very off-road capable. For a large capacity adventure bike, this is about as good as it gets for off-road capability. Now, the downside, when the 1190s first came out, so the 1190s came before the 1090s, they had a few spotty reliability issues, but most people have had good luck with them. Also, especially if you compare it to its lighter weight, more athletic 790 and 890 smaller brothers, these were a little bit more top heavy, a little bit not quite as easy to handle as those smaller bikes. So keep that in mind. Nice to know. So again, KTM, they do an R model for off-roading with the bigger wheels, longer suspension travel, set up for off-road. And then they have the standard or the S model on the 1090s and 1190s, which were more of a road-focused model with a smaller front wheel, less suspension travel, more set up for going on the road. Now, I would highly recommend going to a 1090 Adventure. So they replaced the 1190 with the 1090. It was a better motorcycle overall. We don't have time to get into that, but just more reliable, a better chassis, better suspension, better handling. It didn't really lose much power compared to the 1190. So I'd recommend that 1090. And of course, it was kind of eclipsed and kind of left behind in some way, I guess, when the 790s came out because it was so much lighter, so much better handling than these bigger bikes. But if you want the big power, you want the big V-twin engine, and you don't care too much about off-road as much, then these are amazing bikes to look at. All right, next up, if you want the ultimate off-road capable, lightweight adventure bike, but still want a lot of power, then the KTM 690 or Husqvarna 701 should be at the top of your list. Now, let's talk about the second generation bike. So if you have $10,000 budget, you can get into the second gen bike. So what I mean is that this would be the 2019 and later 690 Enduro or the 2018 and later Husky 701. The reason that's important is because the 690 was completely redesigned. A lot of people think it was an update. It wasn't. It was a totally new bike in 2019. Way smoother engine, more power, better bike in all aspects, new electronics, new everything. So, pros and cons. Way smoother than the old engine. I mean, dramatic. I've owned both the older one with the single counterbalance engine and the newer twin balance engine, 2020 model. So much better. An amazing engine, truly remarkable single-cylinder engine with how smooth it is and how much power it develops. Super light and super fast. This bike can really haul. I mean, you're looking at 74 horsepower on a bike that weighs under 350 pounds. It's impressive. And amazing off-road capability. The suspension is really good for a factory adventure bike suspension. It's not amazing, but it's really, really good. It's the WP Explorer components. The cons, so I've talked about this with the 690s before. For me, they're not the perfect adventure bike and they're not the perfect off-road or dual sport bike. So they're kind of in between, but that can work to your advantage if you don't want to go on a long adventure rides, multi-day rides, luggage and touring and stuff with like a 500EXC, but you also don't want the heavier 890 or 1090 or Africa Twin, something like that, then this is that choice in the middle that gives you some of the best of both worlds, right? So it's really, really good. Other downsides, no matter what you do to it, I owned one of these that had the rally adventure fairing on it and everything from Raid Garage. It's better with that, but because the gearing is so short and tightly spaced, it still feels very busy and very kind of stressed out at 70 to 75 miles per hour on the highway. So keep that in mind. It's never going to be a good high-speed touring bike like the larger multi-cylinder adventure bikes are. What's nice to know, so we've already covered this part. Again, with these 690s, if you can afford it, this second generation bike is really, really amazing compared to the first generation. Next up, of course, we couldn't do this list without the Yamaha Tenere 700. So I'm seeing used Tenere 700s around the $10,000 mark. That may sound a little bit crazy considering when this bike came out, it was $10,000 brand new. But what happened was Yamaha didn't build enough of them, at least here in the USA. They've been in short supply ever since they came out, but especially in the last couple of years, bikes have been selling for way over MSRP, dealer markups, and used bikes have been going for $12,000, $13,000 in many cases. So I think they're starting to come down to reality now as more competitive bikes come out and there's more of these on the market. What are the pros? They're dead reliable. If you want a more simple, more analog adventure bike, you don't need all the fancy electronics. You don't want that. You prioritize reliability and simplicity, but you still want an amazing twin-cylinder, engine that's smooth, torquey, good power delivery, good at doing everything, decent suspension, really good off-road, really good on the road, good looking. I mean, I love the T7. It's a great bike. Super, super reliable. And if I was going on a round the world type of trip, I'd probably take one of these and not my Touareg that I own, not the KTM I own, not the BMW I own. I'd probably get one of these and take this. What are the cons? So we talked about that. The supply shortage has kind of pushed up the prices. And we've also talked about, this is the bike for you if you don't want cruise control, you don't want traction control, you don't want fancy riding modes, you just want a basic, good adventure motorcycle. It's got all the right stuff. So that could be good or bad depending on your perspective, but it's there for you. Next up at the $10,000 level, a lot of people overlook this bike, and you really shouldn't because it's a great motorcycle. This is going to be the BMW F750 and F850 GSs. So these were the continuation or the evolution of the old 700, 750, and 800 and 800 GS bikes. So still, compact parallel twin-cylinder engine, still a 21-inch front wheel, good suspension travel, good off-road ability, but such a better motorcycle than the F800 GS that it replaced. So what are the pros? Good all-around performer, pretty good on the road, pretty good for general street riding, and pretty good off-road. These are definitely easier to handle, quite a bit smaller and lighter than its cohort, the R1250 GS or R1200 GS. And the pro, you've got the BMW warranty, which is really, really good, 3-year standard warranty, and a good dealer network. And usually BMW dealers are pretty good to work with, in my experience at least anyway. What are the downsides? The suspension on these bikes is not great. And if you dig into the reviews on this, you'll find that. No adjustments really on the front forks. Some of the bikes were equipped with electronic suspension for the rear shock. But if you see the bike that says, oh, ESA electronic suspension, you just need to realize that's the rear shock only. It doesn't affect the front shock, the front forks, which is kind of dumb in my opinion. It's not as fast or light or as sexy or good performing as a 790 or 890 Adventure, not even close to that. But it's a bit more refined, a bit more premium, I guess, and I think a bit more reliable than the 790s and 890s. Actually, these have been super, super reliable. Yes, they do have an engine made by Lonsin, which is, I believe, a Chinese firm that makes the engine, but it's a BMW design. Like, don't let that stop you. Like, it's still really, really good. Nice to know. Yeah, totally new bikes versus the 800 GS that it replaced. The Adventure model, so when you see like F850 GS Adventure, that's going to be the larger fuel tank, bigger windshield, stuff like that. If you're more of an off-road focused person, I would stick maybe to the standard model. It's quite a bit lighter, it doesn't feel as top heavy. Also, the differences between like the 750 and the 850, the 750 is going to use a detuned version of the same engine, the same size engine. They just detune it for less power. It's going to be lower to the ground, lower suspension travel, less features, stuff like that. So shorter riders, newer riders, you're going to look like those 750 models. But if you want the full off-road ability, get the 850 model. Next up, a bike that doesn't get too much coverage, but I think is kind of someday going to be very well respected, sort of as a classic, is going to be the Moto Guzzi V85 TT. So I've demoed this bike. I do have a video on it. Very, very cool, very interesting, unique motorcycle, and I think more capable than most people realize. I think it might have been ADV Pulse or one of the big outlets. I did a really good review on this bike. So you should go check that out. So what are the pros? Easygoing, it's classic styling, it's unique. You've got shaft drive. It's the only so-called mid-size adventure bike with shaft drive. So if you hate chain drive, this could be something you want to look at. I think that's really, really unique, and I really like that. It's not too big and it's not too heavy. So you know what it kind of reminds me of is like one of the older GSs, not a 1200 GS or something, but like back when it was the R80 or R100 GS, kind of reminds me of that. Like a little bit smaller, lighter, not as complicated, not as expensive and heavy. So I kind of like that. It's kind of cool. What are the cons? It's not real fast. You're looking around 80 horsepower, but it's enough. Aftermarket's a little more limited because these bikes don't sell in huge numbers. And it's not an off-road race bike. You're not going to keep up with a well-ridden 790 or 890 Adventure or something like that. But for off-road touring, for some light off-roading, it's really quite good. Nice to know you're going to stand out from the crowd. I have a misspelling now, sorry, not crown. Stand out from the crowd, and it's more capable than you might think. All right, that is quite the list, but I think we're finally through it. So a couple things to kind of wrap this up. I just want to send a message. So if you're looking to get into adventure motorcycle riding, first, I think that's amazing. I think you should definitely do it. A few things to keep in mind. Buying a used bike to start out with, or even if it's not your first adventure bike, is always really the most economical, most financially wise thing to do. You're not paying the depreciation. A lot of times you're going to get a lot of extra parts with the bike and accessories that you'd have to pay for if you bought the bike new without any of that stuff. And if you decide to change your mind and you want a different bike, let's say in 6 months or a year or 2 years, if you bought a used bike, again, you're not going to lose as much money. If you had bought a brand new bike, now you're going to be paying all that depreciation when you go to resell it. So great option to get into a used bike. Second point I want to make is that if you're getting into doing more off-road riding, maybe you're a street rider transitioning into more adventure riding, you want to ride off-road, I always say this, but please start, I really highly encourage you to start on a dual sport bike instead of a big heavy adventure bike. The reason is it's going to be way easier to learn off-road motorcycle handling and control and techniques on a smaller, lighter bike. So, you know, a DRZ, a KLR, DR650, CRF 300L, which somehow I forgot and left out of this list, CRF 250L, XT 250, bikes like that. They're so much smaller, easier to deal with. They handle crashes very well, way lighter. You won't be as scared to learn to ride off-road on those bikes. So keep that in mind. I wouldn't recommend going out and getting a 1200 GS if you've never ridden off-road before. I discourage that. Leave that for later once you've learned to ride off-road. So keep those dual sport models in mind. Third thing I want to say is if you're starting to get into this, please consider getting some professional training. So whether you go to a dirt bike class or off-road class, dual sport class, adventure class, go somewhere where there's instructors that will teach you some off-road riding techniques. You'll be safer, more confident, and you'll be able to progress more quickly if your goal is to get into the larger, more powerful, heavier bikes over time. Next thing is that I know I've missed a lot of bikes here, so again, please use the comments section to fill in the gaps. I couldn't include everything, obviously, for time reasons and just for not being able to make the list any longer than it already is. I know I've missed a lot of stuff, so please put down below, what would you choose at these different price levels, or what are your favorite used adventure bikes that you've found? Or if you're in a different part of the world, chime in and let us know, because here in the USA, we miss out on a lot of really cool models that we just don't get here. So let me know down in the comments below. I think that'll be really interesting and a really good community discussion to have. So I sincerely hope this has been useful and informative and educational. I hope it's serving the purpose. I'm trying to do consumer advice and journalism with this channel and not clickbait and hype and all that kind of stuff you see so much these days on social media and YouTube. I hope you're all supportive of that, and if you want this to continue, you want me to keep doing things like this and all the independent motorcycle reviews that I do here, please support the channel, use my affiliate links, subscribe, comment, like, support on Patreon, all those types of things. Other than that, thank you for watching, ride safe, and I'll see you out there.